We are going to be talking about the basics of Orthodox faith and life. Today's lesson our last lesson was on the fall of mankind. What are the two biggest problems that are universal that every human being faces? Sin and death. Sin and death. There's no problem that human beings have that is not sort of encompassed by one of these things. Remember, death includes aging and disease and the sort of decay that comes with our mortal condition. These were both introduced to us through the sin of the first human beings, Adam and Eve, and sort of in a cascade effect down to our lives now. I told you that the world has a problem. This is how Orthodoxy defines the problem. But we didn't talk about a solution yet. I just told you that everything was really bad. But that's not where we're going to leave the story. Today we're going to be talking about Jesus Christ, the promised Messiah of Israel. So, yesterday we learned about the fall of mankind. However, remember, so much of what we experience is the human condition. So much of the negativity, all the bad things we experience as human beings are results of the fall. Particularly the curse. By the way, if you guys just got here, go ahead, take a packet, pass one down to Nektari down there. All the negative results of the fall are the responsibility of Adam and Eve, but they came about, as we read in Genesis chapter 3, through the curse that God put on creation. So that's why human beings are mortal. That's why childbirth and sexuality is the way it is, why it's so messy and deadly. It's because it's part of our fallen world. That's why human beings have to work for a living and can't just live very easily and comfortably off the fat of the land, the way Adam and Eve did when they were in their initial condition. All of the things we experience is the sort of ordinary difficulties of life are because of the fall and the curse that came on human beings because of the fall, because they transgressed the commandments of God. However, even as we saw in pronouncing the curse in Genesis chapter 3, even when God, even from the very beginning, when God sort of condemns us to the condition we're going to be in, he already leaves the seeds of the redemption that's going to come through. So we remember that in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, God, when he's cursing the serpent, remember, who is not, just a literal snake, but is a stand-in for the devil, he says, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed, and it shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." So even from the very beginning, God's intent with the curse was not to condemn us forever, but he said that even though you are cursed because of all of this, I'm going to bring about a plan of redemption. I am going to do something to reverse what's going on. And the reversal of the curse, what's it going to be? It's going to be through the seed of the woman. That is to say, through Eve's descendants, someone is going to come who will smash the serpent, although the serpent will bruise his heel. Remember, what is the bruising of his heel? The crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And now, of course, to crush his head is much more damaging than to bruise his heel, right? But
Achilles did die from a heel wound.
Oh, that's true. And Jesus Christ did die. Truly, I mean, it was a true death. But ultimately, he got the last laugh. Ultimately, Jesus Christ is the victor. So God's fundamental desire was always to bring human beings to himself. It was never anything other than that. At first, God made human beings in paradise to live comfortably and easily, and there was only one commandment to follow. And that would have sufficed because the world had still not fallen into the imperfection we experience now. That just being obedient to one commandment would have sufficed to make them perfect. Just for a period of time, if Adam and Eve had managed to be obedient, then he would, at the proper time, at the appropriate level of their maturity, it's okay, at the appropriate level of their maturity, God would have given them to eat the knowledge of the tree of good and evil because they would have been ready for it, and then to eat from the tree of life and to live eternally with him. But because they chose to transgress the one commandment, now we have plan B. Now we have plan B, and it's going to take a lot more commandments, and it's going to be a lot more difficult, but God's intention was, the scripture says God desires that all men be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. He never brought human beings into being just to condemn them to hell or just to condemn them to death or suffering. Remember that even Jesus, when he talks about hell, he refers to it as what? As the place prepared for the devil and his angels. So human beings were not part of. He wants every human being to be saved. And that's why we disagree so vehemently and viciously with the Calvinists who say that human beings are all predestined. That's monstrous. That's horrifying. It's completely against who we understand God to be. He created some people with the intent and foreknowledge that they would only exist just to suffer eternally in hell. Unfortunately, people are going to end up in hell. But if anyone ends up in hell, it's only after God gave them every single opportunity they had to be saved, and they didn't take a single one. So even when God cursed human beings, it was not part of the original plan, and He was already preparing His redemption for them. However, like so much of what God does, it was not an instantaneous thing. Sometimes we have this sort of erroneous idea that, for God to act in history, it has to be like a snap of His fingers. He should have just snapped his fingers and undid the curse or something. But that's not the characteristic of how we actually see God act in the scriptures. Even the act of creation, though it was a short period of time, it was not instantaneous. It was a process. He did one thing on one day. He did another in that he created, the heavens and the earth at first, and then He rose the land, and then after He made the land, He put the plants on, and after the plants, the animals. It was a process. It unfolded in time. Why should God do things with a snap of His fingers? The way He acts in this world, in space and time, is often through a process, through a sort of act of cultivation and maturation. And that's exactly what Jesus Christ, exactly what God did to bring Jesus Christ into the world, to bring about our redemption through the crucifixion, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, was He had to prepare mankind through a process. The process is, what was it that we're talking about in particular? What I'm referring to is He prepared particular people through certain means. So out of all of the sinful world that existed before the flood, God called only Noah and his descendants. It's not that no one else could have sufficed, but it's that everyone else chose to sin and chose to live in the wickedness of the world. There's this one tradition. What was the evil thing? This is not dogma. This is not dogma of the Orthodox Church, but it was an interesting tradition. What was the evil thing that humans did before the flood that was so wicked that caused God to destroy the world? Does anyone want to take a guess? It's something you've never probably thought of, something I'd never thought of. So what I had heard, one tradition within the Orthodox Church, remember, it's not dogma, it's not absolute truth, but is that human beings before the flood were raising farms of other human beings to kill and eat them. And God said that was so wicked, that's so heinous, I'm going to destroy the world. And only the people who can be saved are those who didn't participate in that world, which was Noah and his descendants. I thought that was very interesting because that is a really horrifying thing, and maybe worth.
Cannibalism?
Yeah.
For real?
Before the flood,
Yeah.
it's thought that it could not be true. It's just.
Oh, no, I'm not arguing.
No,
I agree.
it's just a tradition, but it was so.
Like, boom.
Yeah.
I didn't know that, where does that come from?
So this is something I read in Higher Martyr Daniel Sasoyev. So he's a priest of recent times who was martyred in 2008 or 2009. He's from Russia, and this is what I read in one of his books. I can't cite where source he got it from, or but that's my source.
I mean, I always thought that the flood seemed pretty extreme. But I guess
that's pretty ugly.
Yeah,
I mean, if that's
he was definitely mad.
Desperate times call for desperate measures.
Right. And now keep in mind, the people God destroyed in the flood, He gave them an opportunity for redemption when Jesus Christ descended into Hades and preached to the souls in prison there, as we learned in 1 Peter chapter 3.
Everybody ridiculed Noah out there in the middle of nowhere, building this giant boat. Everybody ridiculed him.
Yep.
And they had an opportunity at that time to, okay, well,
right.
Tell me why you're building this boat. Tell me, what are you going to do?
Oh.
Why are you gathering these animals?
Noah was actually actively preaching for 120 years. So it's not that they had no chance. It's that they didn't take it. And anyway, but so God was cultivating mankind through Noah, and then especially through Abraham and his descendants to make the world ready for His coming. So it's like it's almost like I hesitate a little to use this word, but an act of breeding, right? He's taking the righteous people out of every generation and then teaching them his knowledge of him and his law, so that they have their own righteous children, and creating a lineage like that. So throughout this process, so God is creating a family, a lineage. And remember, if you read the Gospels, if you read the Gospel according to Saint Matthew and to Saint Luke, it's very important, Jesus Christ's lineage. You know, Matthew opens with the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So it's very important who Jesus Christ descends from, the fact that he is a true human being, the fact that he's in line for the throne of Judah. But so history pre-Jesus Christ is all a preparation for the coming of Jesus Christ, because that's what's going to redeem the world from sin and death. But throughout this entire story, so in what way is God cultivating these people? Well, we see, first of all, when he calls Abraham out of the town of Ur in the book of Genesis. We read in Genesis chapter 12, 1-3, "Now the Lord said unto Abraham, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation. I will bless thee, and I will make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So God is telling Abraham ahead of time that I'm going to do some great work through you. I'm going to give you some inheritance that you and your descendants will live in forever. And of course, at the time, people understood that to mean just the promised land, just the physical territory of what's now Israel and Palestine. But in reality, we understand now the true fulfillment of that is an eternal homeland, is the true promised land, which is much better than a piece of earth here on earth, is eternal life in the kingdom. But God takes Abraham and gives him what? Knowledge of himself and knowledge of his commandments, how to please him. And this is part of God. This is the important part of God's process of cultivation. So that's why the Israelites. Who are the Israelites? The Israelites are the blood descendants of Abraham. However, not the only ones. So there were, Abraham gives birth to several children who did not end up becoming the line of Israel. So we have the Ishmaelites, who are the Arabs. You have the Edomites, or the children of Esau, who become someone else. I don't know if we have any living representatives of them anymore. But then through Jacob, so again, after in each generation, God is taking only one or only a handful of people, and through them building the next generation that's going to have knowledge of him, that's going to be obedient to his commandments, that's going to have knowledge of how to please him, so that they could create a righteous and holy lineage, culminating in who?
Jesus.
Before that,
Oh,
Mary.
Mary.
Yeah, because remember, God needed. Think of it this way: we consider someone holy or righteous based on what God does through them, right? The greater a miracle somebody performs, remember, because no human being performs a miracle of their own strength, but they do it because God dwells in them. And who does God choose to dwell in? The righteous. The greater the miracles that come through someone, the more righteous, the more holy we understand them to be. In order for God to bring about his greatest miracle, that is to say, the uniting of human nature and divine nature in his incarnation, if it was God's greatest miracle, then the person through whom it was brought about had to be the greatest human being. It just follows based on our understanding of these things. And it had to be Mary, had to be the mother of God. She had to be the greatest person on earth, behind Jesus himself, of course, in order for God to bring about our redemption through her. So the entire history from Noah through Abraham down to the year, the year 14 BC, because remember, she was 14 years old when she gave birth to Jesus Christ, was to prepare for her, someone who was perfectly pure in mind, body, and soul, in order to be able to receive him. Remember, the high priest of the people of Israel could only stand in the presence of God once a year, for one brief period of time on the day of Yom Kippur, in order to atone for the sins of the people. And even then, he had to fill the Holy of Holies with incense, and he couldn't even have an impure thought in his mind in order to come into the presence of God like that.
I'll explain what those are.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. So in order for the high priest to come into the presence of God in the Holy of Holies in the temple in Jerusalem once a year on the day of Yom Kippur. He couldn't even let an impure thought pass through his mind, lest he drop dead. And there are later Jewish traditions that sometimes they'd wrap a rope around the high priest when he went into the Holy of Holies. Why? So they could drag him out if he died. Think of it, the mother of God had to have God present in her for 9 months and not drop dead. That means she couldn't even have allowed a sinful thought to sort of withstand the presence and power and holiness of the Lord present in her and to bring him into the world. So this whole cultivation of the human race, by teaching them about monotheism, the one true God who created the universe, and by giving them the Torah, which is an expression of the Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible, which is an expression of what God did in history through Abraham, through Moses, and his commandments, what he desires human beings to do. So the whole human history was just to prepare the ground for the coming of Mary, someone who God, in his tremendous holiness, could act through in a way sufficient to bring about what he wanted. So that's that. But throughout this process of cultivation of the people of Israel, there's a continuous repeated pattern of fall and exile leading to redemption, by which God foreshadows his ultimate saving acts. So remember, I said that the ultimate thing God ever did, right, was become a human being for our salvation and then die on the cross and rise on the 3rd day so that we might live eternally with him. However, he leaves his fingerprints all over history and all over the history of the people of Israel because he's continually acting among them in this way. Remember, we talked about the story of Joseph, for those of you who are here in Bible study on Tuesday night. The story of Joseph follows very, very closely the passion of Jesus Christ in a way that's really remarkable. Joseph is sold into slavery by people who hate him. By his brothers who are jealous of him. He is condemned unjustly of a crime he didn't commit. He gets thrown into prison, which we said is an analogy for the grave. And he's down there with the baker and the cupbearer, imaging wine and bread. However, he helps free some of the people who are in prison by interpreting their dreams. And then when he's released from prison, when he rises out of that grave situation, he sits at the right hand of the ruler of Pharaoh and becomes his right-hand man. And what does he do when he becomes the right-hand man of Pharaoh? Well, he redeems his brothers. He redeems the people who sold him into slavery. He redeems the people who had him condemned and forgives them. This is the pattern of Jesus Christ's life acted out in the physical history of the people of Israel. The same thing we see in actually the Exodus and of the children of Israel. So the children of Israel end up in the descendants of Joseph and his brothers who live in Egypt. They live prosperously for a while, but they end up being enslaved. Jesus Christ, according to Philippians, took on himself the form of a slave by becoming human being, and his own people, like Joseph and like the descendants of Joseph, also became slaves. So they were in bondage. However, they were there's a really interesting event that we know about as Passover. When Abraham's descendants were being held in slavery in Egypt, God raised up Moses to deliver the people of God into the land that God had promised to their forefathers. The night before the Israelites were freed, the angel of death passed over the land of Egypt and slew the firstborn males of both man and beast. Only the Israelites who had slain a lamb and spread its blood on their doorposts escaped this judgment of God. This event became known as the Exodus, and it is commemorated every year by the Jews at the Feast of Passover. There's much more, however, to this event than the deliverance of Israel from the bondage to the Egyptians. This event is also a type or foreshadowing of the deliverance which Christ would one day bring to all mankind. So just like the Israelites sacrificed a lamb and then they were saved from death by smearing its blood on our doors, Jesus Christ offered himself as a sacrifice for us. We smear his blood where? On the doors of our senses, that is to say, on our mouths. By eating him, partaking of him, he enters into us and we become liberated from death. So this same pattern plays out again in the history of Egypt, in the history of Israel. Likewise, the Exodus, as they are fleeing from Pharaoh, God opens up the waters. They pass through the waters, and as they're leaving the waters, the Pharaoh's armies follow after them, and then the waters swallow Pharaoh's armies and destroy them. This is an image of baptism. They entered the water slaves. They left it free people. They entered the water pursued by images of the demons in the person of Pharaoh, and they left the water liberated from those that oppressed them. So the whole time, God is dealing, and there are many, many more types. We're going to talk about typology in this lesson. But God's fingerprints of this pattern of fall and exile through with redemption, followed by redemption and salvation, happen again and again and again in the life of his people. Um, in God's acts in history. Why? Because it's the same God acting in the same way. This is his signature. These are his fingerprints. And I said that's why, the Bible so clearly echoes with the acts of the same God. It's why we don't, believe in the Quran. It's why we don't believe in the Book of Mormon, because they don't fit this pattern. They don't follow the same logic that the rest of the Scripture does. That's why we don't accept, certain books that were not included in the Bible, is because they're clearly not inspired by the same Spirit. They're clearly not indicative of the same God acting in the same way. So throughout the history of God raising up this people for himself, he continually acts with this same pattern. Everything God did in Israel's history was a preparation and foreshadowing of Christ. Particularly, though, so the life of Joseph was a foreshadowing of Christ. The Exodus from Israel was a foreshadowing of Christ. The slaughter of the Passover lamb was a foreshadowing of Christ. The building of the temple, all of these different things were foreshadowing of the coming of Christ. But there are three things in particular we want to talk about that sort of foreshadow who Jesus Christ is going to be for the people of Israel. And these are what we could call the three messianic offices. So God instituted three messianic offices in the life of the people of Israel, which were images of Jesus Christ. These were the offices of priest, prophet, and king. Priest, prophet, and king. So through the life of the people of Israel, God tells us what a priest is, what a prophet is, and what a king is, and then so that we can understand who Jesus Christ is when he comes and he perfectly fulfills each of these offices. So again, God discloses in part who he is in the Old Testament, and then so that we have a baseline understanding. I think if he just kind of showed up without laying the groundwork completely in the life of the people of Israel, there'd be no interpretive framework for us to understand who he is or who he did. There'd be no context. We would not come to as clear of an understanding as we have now. So anyway, what are a priest, a prophet, and king? Well, we'll start with a prophet. Prophet we often understand is to be just like a fortune teller, to be someone who says that something's going to happen, and then it happens. Oh, that person's a prophet. That is partly true. That's partly borne out in the people of Israel. But really, a prophet is anyone who speaks on behalf of God and calls others to obedience to God. So maybe one of the signature things by which people understood a prophet to be a prophet was when they had knowledge that only God could have, right? Because someone who can predict the future definitely speaks for God, because only God has knowledge of the future. However, that's not the core of what a prophet is. A prophet is someone who calls others to knowledge of God and obedience to God. So God always raised up prophets when the people of Israel had gone astray. Remember, God's whole act of cultivating Israel out of all the other nations that exist was to do two things: give them knowledge of who he was, monotheism, the one supreme God, and foreshadowing the Trinity, and number two, give them knowledge of how he desires for human beings to live, communicating his Torah, his commandments to them. And the Israelites continuously, repeatedly went astray. They forgot, they worshipped the gods of the nations surrounding them, and they stopped obeying the commandments of the Lord. If you read the Old Testament, this happens a bajillion times. It's a very frequent thing. But it happens all in our lives too, right? How often do I go astray and I stop worshiping God properly? And in fact, I live according to the world and not towards the commandments of Jesus Christ. So we should understand. We should not read these histories and be like, the Israelites, they're so stupid. But we should say, in what way am I like them? Because I think you're going to find out you're exactly like them. I know I certainly am.
It's easy to judge them.
It's easy to judge them, but we're so forgetful. That's the crazy thing about human beings that I feel like people don't have much of a consciousness of, is that we're forgetful. We just forget continuously. We forget who we are. We forget what our purpose is, and we just go with the flow of what's around us until we get carried away. And that's what the Israelites were continuously doing. They're following the. So a prophet is so. When did God raise up prophets? God raised up prophets when the people of Israel were going astray, right? So when they were doing things they shouldn't be doing, God sent a prophet to correct them and get them back on the right track. When they were believing in other gods, God sent a prophet to remind them who the true God is. So to communicate the truth about God and the truth about his will for man, that's what the prophets did. Now we can easily understand Christ is the ultimate prophet, the supreme prophet, the prophet par excellence, because no one can give more clear knowledge of the Father than Christ, who is the Son of God, who reveals the Father. No one can more clearly and easily speak for God than God himself, right? The logic of Jesus Christ as the supreme prophet makes the most sense once we understand ahead of time what a prophet is. So Jesus Christ fulfills the office of prophet. That's why we don't have prophets anymore. In a sense, we do, because some holy saints and elders, they get knowledge of things that are going to happen in the future. I have some, examples. Not that happened to me personally, but have happened to people I know, who, especially with like Elder Ephraim or other saints of recent times, who said something to someone and it turned out to be exactly true, a decade, 2 decades later or whatever. But they're not prophets in the ultimate sense, really. They're not prophets in the ancient sense. The only prophet at this point is Christ himself, and these people are only able to prophesy through Christ himself. Okay, so number 2 is priest. Now, what is a priest? In the Old Testament, the primary function of a priest was to cleanse and sanctify the people through sacrifice. So remember, when God is cultivating the people of Israel, he's communicating knowledge about himself and his commandments, and he's also trying to make them holy. And to be holy is what? Holiness is something that's kind of hard to define, actually, but holiness is that property that uniquely belongs to God. The more like God we are, the more holy we are. The less like God we are, the less holy we are. That's what holiness is. And God wanted to call a holy people into himself, again, so that he could produce, so that people could produce the Virgin Mary, who could bring Jesus Christ into the world. And part of that process, it's not just enough to follow the commandments, but you also need God's supernatural power, right? So we as Christians, as Orthodox Christians, we understand on the one hand we have to live according to the commandments of God, and on the other hand we still need the grace through the sacraments. That's why we come to church. It's not that we just stay at our houses by ourselves and just try to live out the commandments best we can, but we come here and we come to the sacraments and we participate in the life of Christ present in the church, and we get his supernatural power. It's the same thing the people of Israel. So the function of the priests in the Old Testament was to cleanse and sanctify the people through sacrifice, to make them holy through offering animal sacrifices, and the blood would cleanse them and atone for their sins. So that was the function of the priestly role. Now, if any of you have ever read the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, you understand clearly how Jesus Christ fits into this scheme as the ultimate priest. Why? Because he's the supreme priest, and he offers the supreme sacrifice. What is the sacrifice? Himself. He's the only priest to ever sacrifice himself as the offering he gave to God. In order to, the animals, offering the blood of animals to cleanse and sanctify the people was only temporary. You would have to go back and repeat. The high priest of Israel would have to go back and repeat the Yom Kippur ritual every year to atone for the sins of people. It was never sufficient in and of itself to make the people perfect or to perfectly sanctify them. But Jesus Christ offered one sacrifice once and for all. So when we do the divine liturgy here, we are participating in the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, but we're not offering it again. It was already offered, and it sort of echoes through time as the ultimate sacrifice. And in a sense, we're being transported back to that time, but we're not doing the sacrifice again. We can't reoffer what's been offered once and for all. And that's the most acceptable sacrifice, and that's sufficient to make men perfect. The blood of bulls and goats was not sufficient. It was helped. It cleansed people from their sins, but it was imperfect. It was finite. The blood of Jesus Christ is infinite. It's the ultimate Passover. It's the ultimate sacrifice, which cleanses us from our sins, makes us holy, and grants us immortality. So the priest is the primary function of a priest is to offer sacrifice, and Jesus Christ is the ultimate high priest who offered the ultimate sacrifice. Now, we use the term priest to describe me and what I do. It's true, but I only have priesthood insofar as I'm participating in the priesthood of Christ. My priesthood is contingent and temporary. When we get to heaven, I will no longer be a priest. Why? Because Christ will be present to us. There's going to be no need to offer this. I mean, the sacrifice will have been offered, and that's will be how we've got to heaven. But you won't need any human being to stand where I stand, because Christ himself will be there. So I participate in the priesthood of Christ, but I am not more than that. I clothe myself with the priesthood, but that's it. So that's what priesthood is. And now finally, a king. What is a king? We understand rather intuitively what a king is. A king is a ruler, someone who has power, who guides or governs and settles disputes and so on and so forth, and passes laws. We understand very easily that, and remember that most of the kings throughout the Bible were very insufficient for the task ahead of them. Out of 40 kings in the Old Testament, how many were righteous? Do you guys remember? Do you guys know? Have I told you this number before? So out of 40, it was 8. You guys tend to underestimate. No, it was 8. So one in 5. 1 in 5 was actually a good king. However, most of those kings, or perhaps virtually all of them, went astray at one point and then repented. So even of the righteous kings, like David, like Solomon, they had drifted and then they had to be called back. And that should give you an understanding of, like I try to emphasize to Christians, don't put all your hope in Trump or Harris or anything. They're going to be imperfect. They're going to disappoint you. They're not going to they're not going to save your soul. The Bible has a rather negative view of human authority. I don't know, not totally negative, but certainly not super optimistic. It's very realistic. Do you raise your hand?
Yes. Didn't Solomon not repent?
It is unclear what happened to Solomon. So if you go just by the Bible, it kind of seems like that Solomon just ended his life in apostasy.
Yeah.
However, the Bible doesn't tell us about Solomon's death. So we don't know if he managed to mend his ways by the end. I believe he's on, and honestly, I think we're going to read one of the quotes from the church, one of the church fathers here. It seems to have, we're going to read a quote from Saint Ephraim the Syrian here that seems to think that Solomon did apostatize and just stayed in apostasy. However, I also think Solomon's on the calendar of saints. So I think the tradition kind of gives us slightly mixed messages about what ended. But well, I've never met an Orthodox Christian named Solomon in my life. So that might tell you something. Although I do think he's on the calendar somewhere. So mixed messages from the tradition. But if you read the Bible, it's just ambiguous. It looks bad, but it doesn't tell us about his death. So there's a possibility that he got his act together. Okay. So what is a king? A king is someone who rules. Christ is the ultimate king. Why? Because he can communicates to it. He's all powerful. He can actually. That's a good point. He's opandokrator. He's the all powerful one. He can actually enforce the authority of a king. He actually rules over the universe, and he can judge impartially. He can, when you have a human king, you worry about them catering to their own whims or their desires or their imperfect knowledge. Christ has perfect knowledge, has perfect justice. He's the ultimate king. Yes?
I was just going to say, and there's no disputing his authority.
Yeah.
Which is often a problem for kings.
Yeah. Well, there is disputing his authority now, but there won't be. There won't be at the end. So in the sense, that's the one office we might say that has not been completely fulfilled. Because I hope I didn't say anything blasphemous by saying that, but his kingship is going to be fulfilled in the final sense when he comes and actually reigns, and everything is put into subjection to him. Because right now rebellion is possible. Right now we're able to rise up against him, but there's going to come a time when we can't. Okay, so Christ is so the whole history of the people of Israel, right? It wasn't just to make this special people separate from the rest of the world so that they could be redeemed and saved. But it was actually to bring about holy people so that the entire world could come to the knowledge of God. Remember, the prophecy that God made to Abraham said that in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. So again, what modern day Jews kind of get wrong is they don't understand that the point was that at one point the covenant would always be opened up to everyone. It was the covenant that was made with the people of Israel was just temporary. It was just a preparation for the new covenant in Jesus Christ's blood, which is for all human beings who are willing to believe in him and live in subjection to him. And just I sound like a broken record for the people who've heard me a lot, but listen to the prophecy God made to Abraham. Now the Lord said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation. I will bless thee, and I will make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And it says in another part in the prophecy that he'll be the father of many nations. Again, to Abraham, this was the year about 1600 BC. When God pronounced this promise to Abraham. Abraham was a desert nomad who didn't even have an established city for himself. This prophecy came true. It's real. You can look out your window and see that over half the population of the world believes in the God of Israel, believes in the God of Abraham. How do I get the number half? Well, 1/3 of the world is Christians of some stripe. They obviously believe in the God of Abraham, and then another about fifth or 2/5 of the world is Muslim. So they obviously a very distorted belief that they have, and Islam won't save your soul. But they do believe in the God of Abraham. So over half the world has knowledge of Abraham's God according to the prophecy that was made 3,600 years ago and was not fulfilled in Abraham's lifetime. We don't we can see evidence of fulfilled prophecy before our eyes in the world. That is remarkable. I mean, why we don't know about the gods or the prophecies of any other ancient tribe. Maybe some ancient history specialist knows about Mediterranean, Mesopotamian prophecies or Assyrian, but you don't, and I don't. Maybe you do, Tucker. I don't know. The fact that this did happen, it is fulfilled before our eyes. It reminds us that this is reality. This is the world we're living in. It's not, theoretical or abstract. One of my craziest experience, one of the things I love and recommend for everyone, at least when this all calms down, is go to Jerusalem. Pilgrimage to Jerusalem was one of the most fulfilling experiences of my life, one of the most beautiful things. And what's crazy is if you go to Jerusalem, I mean, you see people in one place from like every continent. You see South Americans, Africans, North Americans, Europeans, tons and tons of Indian people. That's what I didn't expect to see. And people from East Asia, all coming to worship who? The God of Abraham. Again, sometimes in really imperfect or heretical ways, but they're not acknowledging any other God while they're there. They're there for the God of Abraham, and that is remarkable. That is remarkable. That is the fulfillment of God's prophecy in our times. Anywho, okay. So, and then there's, keep in mind that priests, prophets, and kings, God showed us what they were through the history of Israel, but I think in most traditional cultures throughout time, there's been something analogous to priest, a prophet, and a king. There have always been, people who speak on behalf of God or the gods, even if they're actually in service of demons. There's these archetypes that are out there. What's really interesting is every human civilization that we know about, at least one that built things and left things behind, had priests and temples, had people who offered sacrifices on behalf of the people. Again, you could go totally wrong with that, like an Aztec, and sacrifice human beings as well. That's not truly what a priesthood should be. But if religion was just a cultural idea, you wouldn't expect it to be so universal. But there's actually something about this that's everywhere. And it's been in every society, even societies that had never heard of the Bible or Abraham. I think it's because people were all descended from Noah ultimately. But it is crazy that this is, everywhere. East Asia, South America, Middle East, Africa, wherever you go, there's priests. There's people offering sacrifices. And because I think something deep down in our DNA understands, that that's the nature of the world, and that's the nature of the bottom of all reality. There's Christ. Sorry, Nektar, you were going to say something?
You already said it for me.
Oh yeah. Anyway, okay, let's move on to our packet. We'll read it, and then we'll go through it, and then we'll be done. Okay, so the fathers speak. So this is Saint Ephrem the Syrian. The lyre of the prophets who proclaimed him, singing before him, and the hyssop of the priests who loved him, eagerly desiring his presence, and the diadem of kings who handed it down in succession belonged to the Lord of virgins, for even his mother is a virgin. He who is king gives the kingdom to all. He who is priest gives pardon to all. He who is the Lamb gives nourishment to all. Let his mother worship him. Let her offer him a crown. For Solomon's mother made him king and crowned him. He apostatized and lost his crown in battle. Behold the son of David, who glorified and crowned the house of David. For you have greatly magnified his throne and have greatly exalted his tribe, and his lyre you have extended everywhere. So this is just reinforcing what I'm talking about, that Jesus Christ, there are prophets before him, there were priests before him, there were kings before him, but he is the ultimate one. Especially as king, he succeeded where the other kings failed, because Solomon fell into apostasy and fell away, at least according to Saint Ephrem, but Jesus succeeds where the others failed, because he is the perfection of all priests, prophets, and kings. But we had to learn about human priests, prophets, and kings before we could understand who the ultimate priest, prophet, and king is, right? That's how they serve as foreshadowing. So even the ones who failed in their office have something to teach us, because they, by contrast, give us the example of what a true priest, prophet, and king is supposed to be. Okay. Even though in Scripture there were many righteous men and friends of God before the coming of the justifier and reconciler, we ought to consider this both in the particular context of their own generation and also with reference to that which was to come. It was for this that they were enabled and prepared, that when the light would shine and they would see it, and when the reality had been disclosed, they would rise above the types and shadows. So all the old priests, the old prophets, the old kings were just to prepare the way of the true God and to give us an understanding. Okay, now we're going to have a brief lesson on typology. Remember, for those of you who are in Bible study, on Tuesday, you already know we already went over typology, but this is worth going over for everyone and just repeating. So we have spoken of certain Old Testament persons or events as being types of something revealed in the New Testament. We noted that the exodus of the Jews from Egypt was a type of deliverance of mankind from sin by the blood of Christ. But what exactly is a type, and why does the church interpret the scriptures in this way? Typology is a method of biblical interpretation whereby certain persons or events, usually in the Old Testament, are seen as signs or foreshadowing of either heavenly realities or future events. This method of interpretation was employed by Christ himself when he cited Jonah's 3-day sojourn in the belly of the great fish as the sign of his 3-day burial. In the book of Hebrews, the priest Melchizedek, to whom Abraham offered a tenth of his goods, is cited as a type of Christ, the great high priest of our salvation. So this is an example of Scripture interpreting itself, or Jesus giving us the clues, because Jesus, made reference to Old Testament figures in the Old Testament in describing himself. So remember, he said he was going to give people the sign of Jonah, referring to his resurrection. He said, like the bronze serpent was lifted up in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up. Jesus Christ taught us in order to understand who he is, we need to look to the Old Testament and what God did in history, and that will give us an understanding. So typology is the way Jesus Christ teaches us to interpret Scripture. Typology is very similar to the literary technique of foreshadowing. Let us suppose that the author of a novel has his main character die in the final chapter by being hit by a car on a deserted country road. Let us also suppose that in an earlier chapter, the main character comes upon a dead animal, obviously hit by a car on a deserted country road, and that in order to avoid the animal, he swerves off the road and damages his car. Because of this minor accident, he misses an important meeting and the course of his life is altered. The dead animal in the road is a specific function in the development of the plot up to that point. We might have no reason to suspect that the animal carcass has any other meaning. When, however, we read the last chapter and learn that the main character is being killed by being hit by a car on a deserted country road, we think back to the dead animal in the earlier chapter. The author could have used any excuse to keep the main character from getting to his meeting. His car could have simply broken down. He could have had a minor accident with another car at a busy intersection, or he could have swerved to miss a large tree limb in the middle of the road. Instead, the author chose to foreshadow the death of the main character by using an animal that had also been hit by a car. So remember, we understand an author to be a good author if they're able to tie sort of all the themes of their book together. There's this idea called Chekhov's gun from the famous writer Anton Chekhov. He says, if you see a gun, if you as an author, you describe a gun sitting on a mantle in Act 1, by Act 3, that gun better have shot somebody, because nothing in literature should be superfluous, right? You give the details as are necessary to interpret the rest of the story. What's really remarkable about the Bible is written by all these different people. Over all these different eras in multiple different languages, and yet you still have all these Chekhov's guns that are coming together and being fired. It's a bit of a silly analogy, but if you understand what I'm saying, is these things weave together so beautifully, and it speaks to the authorship of God on top of the human authorship. While the actual text of the Bible is written by men, the true author of the story is God himself. Indeed, he is both the author and the main character. Throughout the history of Israel, God was preparing Israel and the world for the coming of his Son. When the Son was finally revealed in human flesh, the eternal significance of the history came to life. Yes, it came to light. The Jews whom Moses led out of Egypt had no indication that their exodus meant anything more than their escape from physical bondage. However, its real significance was not, or maybe we should say full significance, because it already had real significance, but its full significance was not understood until the coming of Christ, who delivered all mankind from the bondage of sin and death through the shedding of his blood. So remember, Christ, in revealing the meaning of things in the past, he takes things that happen to individuals in history and opens it up sort of cosmically. So in the Exodus, God just saved the people of Israel. But in the resurrection, God saves everyone who's willing to be saved. I can't think of any examples, I'm tired. But you understand, he takes something that was limited and expands it to a cosmic scope and scale. The church interprets all the Holy Scripture, both Old and New Testaments, in the light of Christ, and typology is the primary method used. 2 points need to be clarified, however. First, because God is both author and main character, the types do more than simply foreshadow. In some way, they actually participate in the event being typified. When the Israel escaped from Egypt, she was participating, again in a very limited way, in the deliverance of Christ. Yeah, that's we should remember that this is, when we talk about the Bible, we're talking about a story. But we are talking about the true story of the world. It's not just the product of someone's imagination. So it's possible to participate in it, and those who were part of those events were participating in them, even the foreshadowing. Finally, we must understand that typology is different from allegory. Allegory is a method of interpretation also used by the apostles and church fathers, whereby a moral or philosophical point is extracted from a story without regard to its literal meaning. These two types of interpretation are not mutually exclusive. The fathers teach us that a passage may have a literal, typological, and allegorical meaning at the same time. This is what we mean when we say the scriptures have layers of meaning, have depth. You don't have to sacrifice the one for the other. They can all be at play. For example, the story of Exodus refers to the literal deliverance of Israel from bondage in Egypt. It is also a type of the deliverance wrought by Christ on the cross, another historical event. Finally, it may also be interpreted allegorically as the deliverance from the soul from sin. So you can say, you can talk about the Exodus being an example of your own life, of how you yourself were delivered from sin by God. You can read it allegorically in that way without sacrificing the other meanings of it. This latter method is used frequently during Great Lent when the hymnographers invite us to put ourselves in the place of Old Testament characters and see their struggles as an allegory of our own personal spiritual journey. And that's something that bears repeating, bears emphasis. It's not just when you read the Old Testament, you see, look at all the silly people who did those stupid things and committed those sins. No, find yourself in the story. Understand that this is talking about you as much as it's talking about the literal things that happened in the past. Okay, so this is a relatively short lesson, but we'll just go through these. Questions for reflection. Who is the father of the people of Israel? Abraham. What did God promise to him concerning his offspring?
Be blessed by him, and they would be many nations.
Yep. All the families of the world would be blessed through him, and that they would inherit the promised land, crucially. In what way was the Passover lamb slain at the time of Exodus a foreshadowing of Christ?
Because he himself is a Passover lamb that he sacrificed.
Yeah, explain to me how it works. Or where's the analogy there?
So the Israelites sacrificed the lamb and smeared blood on the door so that the angel of death wouldn't appear over them. Likewise, Christ offered himself on the cross, and we partake of his blood so that death doesn't come over us.
Perfect. Nailed it. To whom did God reveal the Ten Commandments and the instructions for proper worship? I didn't say this explicitly, but Moses. It's basic biblical history. So remember, God, for the people of Israel, wanted to give them true knowledge of himself and knowledge of his will, how he wanted human beings to live. What did Israel believe about God that set her apart from other nations? This one I didn't say explicitly, but I did mention it in passing. That was one thing, but what was it about what about the Israelite belief in God was unique among ancient Near Eastern cultures? Maybe that's a way to phrase it. There was one God. There was one supreme God who was worthy of worship. Now they did acknowledge the existence of other divine figures, other gods with a small g, but they were understood to be demons for the most part.
Question on that.
Yeah.
So the Israelites, did they actually understand then that the God they were worshiping is like the true creator of everything in all the universe?
Yeah.
They didn't think he was equal with the other ones?
No, that comes up again and again if you read the Old Testament. They refer to him as the God who created the heavens and the earth. So yeah, his specific identity was not just that he was the God of Israel, but that he was the God who created all things.
Back in the time of Abraham, like every city had a god, like
Yeah.
or Sumer or Babylon.
Yep.
They all had their own deities and basically going at each other deities with their armies.
Yeah, exactly. So the ancient Near East was very different. Most gods were tied to places. So like Babylon might have one god, and Nineveh might have another god, and yeah, exactly. And your family might have its own gods. You had little idols in your home. So there's just a multiplicity of gods who are often at odds with one another. And often one important thing is they often didn't make very strong moral demands of people. They didn't care if you cheated on your wife or not. They cared whether you honored them or not. And that's what was very significantly different about God's self-revelation to the people of Israel is that he actually had moral commands. It's not just about you have to obey me and give me the honor that's due to me, but you have to treat each other nicely as well. And that's why it's important that God gave them the Torah. You can't. I know nowadays we're used to just a small number of religions, many of which are derived from Christianity, and we all understand the idea that gods care about morals. That is not a given throughout human history. That is not a given. It was unique. It was maybe not fully unique, but it was rather unique among the ancient people that God revealed to Israel. Yes, Nektari.
Just a little side pause. Remember, there's the point in the Bible where the Israelites war with a different nation, and the battle takes place on the mountains. And so that nation's like, okay, we were defeated on the mountains because Yahweh was the God of the mountains. And so they went to battle again in the flat plains to show that God was not just the God of the mountains.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. You have to show me where that is in particular, because it's very important. Yeah.
So when God revealed himself to Abraham, it was because is it because when Abraham was praying to all the gods, he prayed to the unknown God, and that ended up being God, right? Isn't that how that story goes?
The honest truth is I cannot remember why Abraham gets called and not others.
Because
I think there is something to the idea that Abraham did not participate in the idol worship of the people around him, but I can't remember in detail.
Okay, because I was reading Acts, and Paul says to the Greeks, you guys are already really religious. I see an altar to the unknown God, and I thought that was so the Greeks not knowing that they were worshiping Jesus and actively were with that altar to the unknown God, or
so yeah, you can interpret things that way. I mean, Jesus himself says to the Samaritans, you worship what you do not know. So they had a meaningful worship of. You could have, at least it's conceivable, because a lot of non-Christian religion is worship of demons, but it is at least conceivable to have a worship of God, of the true God, but in a sort of level of ignorance, according to the scriptures at least. The interesting thing about the book of Acts, chapter 17, what you're talking about, I love that passage. I don't know why. Maybe some Greek, I don't know. But when Paul's missioning to the Greeks, he goes to them and he sees that you have an altar, you have all these altars to the different gods. The explanation I've heard of that I came from a particular Orthodox deacon. I can't tell you where he got his information from, but it's that basically at the time of an earthquake or a plague, I forget what it was, the Greeks didn't know what to sacrifice to, so they let loose a bunch of lambs or goats or whatever, and they all went up to the altars of different gods, and they said, okay, whatever god the animal goes to, you sacrifice it to that god. And then one of them didn't go up to a god in particular. And they said, well, what's that lamb doing, or goat, or whatever it was? And they said, well, we'll sacrifice it to the unknown God that lamb has gone to. Yeah. So maybe the Greeks at that point in time, they sensed that maybe there's another power at work here that we don't know about, and they sacrificed it there. And God and Paul used that as an opportunity to say, hey, there is this other God that you guys acknowledge that there's this other power at work. Let me tell you about that other power. And that's many times in the history of the mission to the Orthodox Church, you can say, sometimes you go to a pagan people and say, well, you're clearly engaged in demon worship, that needs to stop, and you need to worship the true God. Other times, the great missionaries and saints have gone to a people and said, you already believe in XYZ God, have XYZ mythology. You have most of the story. Let me tell you the full story. So it depends. It depends kind of on the situation. Kind of depends on how degenerated that people's religion is. But it's a way to mission to people, because all human beings have a spermatikos logos, have a seed of the truth in what they believe. Because all the world proclaims Christ. So yeah. Wow, that was a huge digression. I apologize. What does the word prophecy literally mean?
Kind of see the future?
No. It was What does a prophet do? I said see the future is a sign of a true prophet sometimes, but
Speaks
Prophecy.
about
to
those-
speak,
Yeah.
to speak on behalf of God. So prophecy literally means speaking forth. So a prophecy doesn't necessarily have to be about the future, although that's what's commonly understood in modern English. When you talk about a prophecy, you're talking about something in the future, but the actual original meaning does not necessarily mean that. How do the prophets foreshadow the work of Christ?
typology
Typology.
in the
What does a prophet do?
speaks the word.
Predicts.
Gives information about
Callers.
things that people could then connect back to when things happen.
Yeah, so a prophet speaks on a prophet gives us true information about the true God and what he desires from human beings. So Jesus Christ is the ultimate prophet because he being God himself is more qualified than any human prophet to tell us who God is and what God wants from us. So that's why he's the ultimate prophet. What was the job of the high priest in the Old Testament? How is this related to the work of Christ?
Sacrifice and forgiveness.
Yeah,
Christ himself sacrificed for forgiveness.
perfect. Exactly. The priest made people holy and through sacrifices and atoned for their sins. And Jesus is just the ultimate priest and the ultimate sacrifice. Which Old Testament figure is a type or figure of the kingship of Christ? Actually,
Didn't we speak of Joseph?
But none of the
so
kings-
he was not a king. Joseph was at the right hand, was the Pharaoh's vizier.
Pharaoh's second.
Yeah. Honestly, I actually don't know what particular answer he's trying to get at from this book. You could say, you could say that David really
I was about to say, David Rock.
yeah.
I've seen bricks that still exist that he stamped with his. We were talking about, what was it when you have a scribe stamp?
hmm
This,
The seal. Yeah.
yeah. Anyway, they still exist in Iraq.
Wow.
There's bricks that were actually with his ring or his stamp or whatever you want to call it. They
That's remarkable.
still have the mark of King David.
Yeah, so yeah, David was kind of for the Israelites the archetypal king. Now he did sin, but he also repented very fervently for his terrible sins. We could also say though maybe Melchizedek, the king of Salem, is a kingly type of Christ. I think what the book wants us to say is David though. So, okay, what is the method of biblical interpretation whereby the history of Israel is interpreted in light of the coming of Israel's Messiah? One word answer. Typology. All right, that's it. Okay, we'll say a closing prayer. Christ our God, you are the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. You have completed the divine plan of the Father. Fill our hearts with joy and gladness, now and ever into the ages of ages. Amen. God bless you guys. Have a good day. It was nice to be with you. I'll upload this online. But go enjoy yourselves. Have a peaceful Sunday afternoon.